Justin, last night the New York Post editorial board called out President Trump for ignoring the affordability crisis, comparing him to President Biden. Is this president making the same mistake as his predecessor?
It's difficult because at the one level, that might be a political question. What's the best way of handling an inflation crisis? Do you lie to people about what's in front of their eyes? I'm more qualified to speak about the economic question, which is there's something very interesting here, which is what happened under President Biden was prices rose. Typically with inflation, as prices rise, what happens is what you're selling at work rises, therefore your boss can afford to give you a pay rise and eventually your wages rise to catch up. That was a very hard message to sell, although it's the truth. The thing is, when prices rise because costs rise, and that's what tariffs are doing, they're causing tariff-driven, cost-driven inflation. Prices go up, but your boss doesn't have any more money left over at the end of the month. Your boss has no easy way to give you a wage rise to catch up. So in fact, this form of inflation is much more costly and much more painful for households.
Justin, it seems obvious. You've got average Americans that are saying this. How is that not getting through to the administration? How are they able to defend that?
Alex, isn't that just the conversation we've been having now for years, which is how does someone look the American people in the eye and lie to them? How should you respond as someone in the media? And how should I respond as an economist? So first of all, for those who are interested in the facts are the government goes out and collects extremely detailed data about prices. And the fact that you see in the grocery store is borne out all around the country, which is prices are rising. They're rising at about 3%. That's better than the worst days of COVID and worse than the Federal Reserve and most Americans want. We can feel that pain. We can see that pain. And the president's only response has actually been to further that pain by following the sorts of policies that will feed even more inflation in the future.
Okay, so Gillian, it is true that the stock market has been doing consistently well this year, along with Americans who have money in the stock market. But for less wealthy Americans, the economic picture is much more bleak, and they are cutting back on spending. And that's leading economists to warn of a K-shaped economy. Can you explain what that is, what it means?
Well, absolutely. And it really feeds into what Justin's been talking about because President Trump keeps saying consumption is good, everything's great. And on one level, he's actually correct because overall consumer spending has indeed held up much better than most people expected. However, there is an absolutely crucial catch, which is that unfortunately, a very large chunk and a rising chunk of overall consumer spending is now being driven by the wealthiest group. In fact, today, the top 10% account for half of all consumer spending. They used to only be about a third. And many of the wealthier groups are being driven by the stock market having surged. And so one of the questions right now is that if the stock market is starting to look wobbly, is that going to essentially cause the wealthy Americans to cut back? And secondly, will that then bring into focus the fact that many Americans who don't have lots of stocks have been suffering and cutting back already?
And if it doesn't begin looking wobbly, Gillian, does that mean that the divide between the haves and the have-nots will get even greater?
Unfortunately, that is indeed very likely because you really do have a situation where asset price inflation has been far more dramatic than consumer price inflation. By that, I mean that the stocks have been going up much faster than everyday items. And so that's a real squeeze for many Americans. And ironically, the fact the Supreme Court is now discussing the tariffs, the fact that President Trump has just seemingly struck a deal with President Xi of China may just give them some kind of out on the tariffs, because as Justin said, the tariffs have been heaping up pressure on the inflation as well.
Yeah. Justin, part of the reason the stock market's doing so well is because of a surge in AI investments. Any concerns this is a bubble, and what happens if it is and it pops?
Alex, I have a lot of concerns, but that's because I'm paid to worry for a living. So if you know an economist who hasn't had Botox yet, you send them off to the plastic surgeon because that's what we all need. Look, there's an optimistic case that this is a marvelous new technology that's going to make us all productive and fuel a second or third industrial revolution, however you count it. The adjustment along the way could be painful, but it could get us to a beautiful nirvana. There are also very real concerns that we've seen this movie before, that sometimes people get a little bit too hyped about the latest thing coming out. Certainly, that happened with the Nasdaq and tech stocks back back around the turn of the century. So I think anyone who tells you that they're sure that this is a bubble is overconfident. There are very smart people betting trillions of dollars that there's really some there. Equally, anyone who tells you they're sure that this is definitely going to work out is perhaps a little bit too optimistic. It's one of the many big risks we face.
Okay, that means stand by. All right, Justin, Jillian, thank you both so much.